California, 1849. A family named Whitfield has been living in a canvas and timber cabin near the American River for 4 months. The cabin is not really a cabin. It is a frame of rough-cut pine logs with canvas stretched across the gaps where a proper builder would have used planking. The roof leaks when it rains. The floor is packed dirt that turns to mud when the roof leaks. It is the best shelter Thomas Whitfield could construct with the materials available after spending everything the family had on the journey west. Thomas left a dry goods store in Independence, Missouri in the spring of 1849. He had read the newspaper accounts of the gold strike at Sutter's Mill. He had calculated the odds the way a shopkeeper calculates odds, with optimism applied to numbers that did not support it. He sold the store. He bought a wagon, 2 mules, flour, salt pork, tools, and a gold pan. He loaded his wife Margaret, his 15-year-old daughter Sarah, and his 12-year-old daughter Anne onto the wagon and joined the river of humanity flowing west toward the thing that the newspapers promised was waiting for anyone brave enough to come and pick it up. The gold never materialized. Thomas pans 12 hours a day in water cold enough to numb his hands within minutes. He finds dust, flakes so small they disappear between his fingers. In 4 months of work, he has recovered less than 3 ounces, worth roughly $48, at the inflated prices the camps charge for everything. Flour that cost 2 cents a pound in Missouri costs $1 a pound on the American River. Salt pork is $4 a pound. A single egg costs more than a day laborer earned in a week back east. The family is surviving. Barely. The savings that funded the journey are nearly gone. The store in Missouri is sold to someone else. There is nothing to go back to. The nearest settlement is a camp of 600 men and 11 women. It has no name that everyone agrees on. Some call it Whitfield Bar after the bend in the river. Some call it by a name that references the violence that occurred there the previous summer. It has no sheriff, no courthouse, no jail, no church, no school, no doctor. No law of any kind except what a man can enforce with whatever weapon he owns, and whatever neighbors are willing to stand beside him when enforcement is required. The 11 women in the camp are wives of miners, 2 of them, and women whose presence in the camp's 3 saloon tents is understood without discussion. On a Tuesday evening in November, 3 men rode up to the Whitfield cabin. They were not miners. They carried no pans, no shovels, no picks. They carried revolvers and a confidence that men carry when they know the landscape they operate in better than the people who live on it. They had been watching the Whitfield claim for 2 days from a ridge above the river. They knew Thomas owned a single-shot rifle. They knew Margaret and the 2 girls were in the cabin during the hours Thomas worked the river. They knew the nearest occupied claim was 1.5 miles downstream, and that the terrain between the 2 claims was dense enough with pine and manzanita that sound did not carry. What happened to the Whitfield family that evening was not recorded in any court because no court existed within 100 miles. It was not investigated by any lawman because no lawman had jurisdiction over a river bar in the unorganized territory that California remained until statehood the following year. It was not unusual. The California Gold Rush is taught as an adventure story. The great westward migration, the pioneering spirit, the birth of the American dream in the rivers and mountains of the Sierra Nevada. What is not taught is what happened to the families who followed that dream into a landscape where the absence of law meant the absence of protection. And the people who understood that absence best were not the miners. They were the predators who followed them. The gold rush you learned about in school is a story about opportunity. The 49ers loading wagons and heading west. The prospector, knee-deep in a mountain stream, pen in hand, finding the nugget that changes everything. The boom towns springing up overnight, raw and rough but full of the democratic energy that Americans have always told themselves is the engine of their civilization. San Francisco rising from a village to a city in months. California transforming from a remote Mexican territory into the Golden State that would become the largest economy in the American West. The story is exciting. The story is American. The story is also a lie of a mission so vast that what it leaves out dwarfs what it includes. Between 1848 and 1855, an estimated 300,000 people migrated to California. The overwhelming majority were men, single men, young men who had left families behind or who had no families to leave. Men who had quit jobs, abandoned debts, walked away from responsibilities, and headed west with nothing except the conviction that gold would make every sacrifice worthwhile. The gender ratio in the mining camps was staggering. In some camps, the ratio reached 30 men to every woman. In others, it was higher. The mining regions of California during the peak years of the rush constituted the most gender-imbalanced population center in American history. The legal infrastructure was virtually non-existent. California operated under military governance from the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 until statehood in September of 1850. Military governance meant that a handful of military officers were nominally responsible for law and order across a territory of over 160,000 square miles into which hundreds of thousands of people were pouring. Monthly, the officers were concentrated in coastal settlements. The mining regions, spread across the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada from the Feather River in the north to the Tuolumne in the south, operated in a legal vacuum that statehood did not immediately fill. After 1850, California had a constitution, a governor, and a legislature. It did not have a functioning judicial system in the mining regions. Courts were established in Sacramento and San Francisco. They were not established in the hundreds of camps scattered across mountain terrain that could take days to reach on horseback. A crime committed on an isolated claim in the Sierra foothills in 1851 might as well have been committed on the surface of the moon for all the legal response it would generate. The nearest judge might be a week's ride away. The nearest jail might not exist. The legal apparatus that Americans had taken for granted in the states they had left behind had not made the journey west with them. They had migrated into a landscape where the only law was proximity and the only enforcement was personal. The people most vulnerable to this absence were not the armed men on the claims. The people most vulnerable were the women and children who accompanied them, the wives who had followed their husbands west, the daughters who had been loaded onto wagons alongside the flour and the gold pans and the dreams. They had arrived in a territory where no institution existed to protect them from the men who had come west, not to pan rivers, but to prey on the people who did. If you want to understand what happened to these women and daughters, what the gold rush actually did to the families that chased the dream into lawlessness, what the word depredations concealed when frontier accounts used it to describe what was done to women on isolated claims, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because the gold rush story you were taught left out the people who paid the highest price. Stay until the end because the system that consumed them was not random violence. It was an economy. And economies leave evidence that the people who ran them never intended to survive. The geography made everything possible. Not the gold, the geography. The physical landscape of the California mining regions created conditions of isolation so extreme that the families who settled on claims existed in a vulnerability that no amount of determination or firearms could fully address. Gold deposits in California were distributed along rivers and streams that cut through the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada. The terrain was steep, forested, and broken by canyons and ridges that divided the landscape into pockets separated by distances that were short on a map and enormous on foot. A family on a claim at the head of a canyon might be 2 miles from the nearest neighbor measured in a straight line and 6 miles by the only trail passable with a mule. The forest was dense. Pine and manzanita and oak created a canopy that absorbed sound the way water absorbs stone. A gunshot fired at one claim might not reach the ears of a miner working at the next. A scream would not carry at all. The families who settled these claims understood the isolation in practical terms without fully understanding its implications. They knew they were alone. They knew help was distant. They took precautions that their circumstances allowed. A rifle by the door, a dog if they could afford to feed one, an agreement with the nearest neighbor to check on each other at intervals. These precautions were adequate against animals and against a casual opportunist who might steal a tool or a sack of flour. They were not adequate against organized men who had studied the claim, counted the weapons, mapped the approaches, and chosen the hour of their arrival based on the daily patterns of the family they intended to destroy. The demographics of the mining regions compounded the geographic vulnerability. 300,000 people spread across a territory that had contained fewer than 15,000 non-indigenous inhabitants before the gold strike. The population was overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly young, and overwhelmingly transient. Men moved from camp to camp following rumors of strikes. They arrived at a claim, worked it until it played out, or until a better rumor reached them, and moved on. The transience meant that no one knew who anyone was. A man who appeared at a camp claimed whatever name and whatever history he chose. No documents were checked, because no documents were required. No references were sought, because no system of reference existed. A man who had committed a crime at one camp could walk 30 miles to the next camp and arrive as a stranger with a clean history and no past. This anonymity was the operating environment that the outlaw economy required. Men who targeted families on isolated claims did not need to hide their identities because their identities were whatever they claimed them to be. A man who robbed and brutalized a family near the Yuba River on Monday could be panning for gold near the Feather River on Wednesday, indistinguishable from the thousands of other transient miners moving through the landscape. No wanted posters, no telegraph system to transmit descriptions, no organized law enforcement to coordinate a search across the dozens of camps that a fugitive could disappear into within days of committing a crime. The camps themselves offered no safety to the families who lived near them. A mining camp in 1849 was not a town. It was a temporary gathering of men around a resource, organized for the purpose of extraction rather than habitation. The structures were canvas tents and rough timber sheds. The social institutions were saloons, gambling operations, and whatever informal agreements the miners had reached about the boundaries of their claims. The camps had no police. Some had informal miners' courts that adjudicated claim disputes and occasionally addressed theft. These courts did not investigate crimes committed on claims outside the camp's immediate perimeter. They did not have the authority, the resources, or the inclination to extend their jurisdiction beyond the boundaries that the miners who created them had defined. A family on a claim 2 miles outside a camp of 600 men was beyond the reach of whatever minimal order the camp maintained. The 600 men were neighbors in the geographic sense. They were not protectors in any meaningful sense. The family was on its own. The men who preyed on gold rush families were not the romanticized bandits of dime novels and Hollywood films. They were not charming rogues who robbed stagecoaches with a wink and a pistol and redistributed wealth to the deserving poor. They were professionals operating in an economy of predation that the gold rush had created as reliably as it had created the economy of extraction that drew 300,000 people west. The outlaw ecosystem of the mining regions organized itself around a simple recognition. The gold rush concentrated wealth in the hands of people who could not protect it and distributed those people across a landscape where no one would protect them. The combination was irresistible. The outlaws who exploited it fell into categories as distinct as the categories of miners they targeted. Road agents operated on the trails that connected camps and settlements. They positioned themselves at choke points, river crossings, and mountain passes and narrow canyon trails where travelers could not avoid them and could not maneuver around them. Their targets were miners carrying gold to trading posts and families moving between camps with their possessions loaded on mules and wagons. Road agents worked in groups of 3 to 6, large enough to overwhelm resistance from a single armed man and small enough to move quickly and disappear into the terrain after the robbery was completed. They were efficient. They took everything: gold, weapons, supplies, animals. When their targets included women, they took more than property. The trail accounts that survive describe encounters with road agents in language that distinguishes sharply between what was done to men and what was done to women. The men were robbed. The women experienced something the accounts describe with the word outrage, a term that 19th century writers used when the actual description was impossible within the conventions of published language. Claim jumpers operated differently. They targeted not travelers but settlers. A family that had established a productive claim, or a claim that a jumper believed was productive, was visited by men who informed the family that the claim was theirs. The confrontation that followed was decided by numbers and weapons. A family with a single rifle facing 4 armed men did not prevail in the negotiation. The claim jumpers took the claim. They also took whatever else the family possessed, including, when daughters or wives were present, the women themselves. The jumpers understood that a family driven off a claim in the wilderness had no recourse, no court to petition, no sheriff to file a complaint with, no mechanism of any kind for recovering what had been taken. The family walked away with whatever the jumpers permitted them to keep, which was often nothing, and the claim and everything on it belonged to the men with the most guns. The most organized predators were the gang networks that operated across multiple camps. These were not spontaneous groups formed for a single crime. They were persistent organizations with leadership structures, territorial claims, and information networks that tracked the movement of families through the mining regions with a commercial attentiveness that the legitimate economy would have recognized as market research. The gangs knew which families had arrived recently with savings from back east. They knew which claims were isolated enough to attack without witnesses. They knew which cabins contained daughters. The information flowed through the saloons and trading posts where gang members mixed with the general population, invisible, because the transient anonymity of the camps made everyone invisible. A man buying whiskey at a bar in Hangtown who asked a miner about the families on the upper claims was not conducting an interrogation. He was having a conversation. The information he gathered from that conversation would determine which cabin received visitors that week. The vulnerability began before the families reached California. The journey itself was the first stage of victimization, a months-long exposure to lawlessness that weakened families physically, financially, and psychologically before they arrived at the mining regions where the real predation awaited them. The overland trail from Missouri to California covered roughly 2,000 miles. The journey took 4 to 6 months, depending on weather, route, and the condition of the animals pulling the wagons. Families traveled in wagon trains for mutual protection, groups of 10 to 50 wagons moving together across the plains and mountains with the understanding that numbers provided safety that individual families could not achieve alone. The system worked on the open plains where visibility was unlimited and where a train of 40 wagons presented a target too large and too well armed for most bandits to attempt. The system broke down in the mountains. As wagon trains entered the Sierra Nevada, the trails narrowed. The terrain forced trains to stretch into single-file lines that extended for miles, separating the lead wagons from the rear by distances that made mutual support impossible. Families at the back of the train were effectively alone, moving through forested mountain terrain with the same isolation they would experience on their claims. Bandits who operated along the mountain trails understood this. They targeted the trailing wagons, the families that had fallen behind the main body because their animals were slower or their wagons were heavier or their luck was worse. Some families never made it to the train at all. The promise of gold created an urgency that overrode caution. Families that arrived at the jumping-off points too late to join an organized train headed west alone or in groups of 2 or 3 wagons, calculating that the risk of traveling without the protection of a large group was acceptable given the reward that waited at the end of the trail. The calculation was wrong. Small family groups moving through the mountains without the deterrent effect of a large armed train were the preferred targets of trail bandits. They could be overwhelmed quickly. They could be robbed completely. And when the robbery included daughters and wives, the isolation of the mountain trail ensured that what was done to them was witnessed only by the trees and the men who did it. Families robbed on the trail arrived at the mining camps with nothing. The savings that were supposed to fund the purchase of tools and supplies and the initial months of claim work were gone. The supplies that were supposed to sustain the family until the claim produced were gone. The weapons that were supposed to provide protection were gone. A family that arrived at a mining camp destitute was a family that had lost not just its resources, but its capacity to resist whatever came next. Destitution in the mining regions was not the genteel poverty of the eastern states, where charitable institutions and community networks provided at least a minimal safety net. Destitution in the camps was absolute. There was no charity. There was no welfare. There was no institution of any kind designed to catch families that had fallen to the bottom. There was only the economy of the camps, which offered men manual labor at subsistence wages and which offered women something else entirely. A woman arriving at a mining camp without resources, without a husband capable of providing, without savings or supplies or any means of independent survival, faced a set of options that the camps had structured with a precision that was not accidental. She could starve. She could beg in a population that had little sympathy for failure, because failure contradicted the mythology that had drawn everyone west. Or she could enter the economy that the camps had built specifically to absorb women in her condition. The saloons, the dance halls, the establishments whose doors were open to women who had nothing left except what the establishments wanted from them. The trail robbery that had taken the family's gold had also taken the family's ability to resist the system that waited at the end of the trail. The predation did not end with the robbery. The robbery was the first step in a process that delivered women from one form of exploitation to the next. The attacks on isolated claims followed a pattern so consistent across the fragmentary accounts that survive that the consistency itself constitutes evidence of organization rather than coincidence. The same sequence repeated at claim after claim, canyon after canyon, river bar after river bar, across the mining regions. The men who carried out these attacks had either developed the pattern independently through trial and error, or had learned it from others who had refined it before them. Either way, the pattern was efficient and it was devastating. The scouting came first. The men who targeted a family on an isolated claim did not arrive spontaneously. They watched. From ridge lines above the claim, from the tree line at the canyon's edge, from positions that the terrain provided in abundance to anyone who understood how to use it. They observed the family for days. They noted the daily routine, what time the father left the cabin to work the river, how long he stayed, whether he carried his rifle to the river or left it at the cabin, whether the mother and daughters remained inside during the working hours or moved around the claim, whether a dog was present, whether neighbors visited. The scouting was reconnaissance in the military sense, a systematic gathering of information designed to eliminate uncertainty before the operation began. The approach was timed to the father's absence, or was conducted with enough force to neutralize him immediately. Some accounts describe attacks that occurred while the father was working the river, the men arriving at the cabin during the hours when only the women and children were present. Other accounts describe attacks in the evening when the entire family was in the cabin. The men arriving with enough numbers and enough weapons to control the situation before the father could reach the single rifle that most families possessed. A single-shot rifle against 3 revolvers was not a contest. The mathematics of frontier violence were simple, and they favored the men who had planned the encounter over the men who had not. The father was dealt with first, killed in some accounts, beaten unconscious in others, restrained with rope while the men conducted their business with the efficiency of professionals performing a task they had performed before. The word efficiency appears in accounts written by people who discovered the aftermath of these attacks, a word chosen to describe the evidence of method rather than frenzy. The cabins were searched systematically. Gold was taken. Weapons were taken. Supplies were taken. The search was thorough because the men knew where miners hid their dust and their savings, knowledge acquired through the same information networks that had identified the family as a target in the first place. Then the women. The frontier accounts that survive use words that function as locked doors, depredations, outrages, offenses against the persons of the women. Each word, a barrier placed between the reader and the reality. A linguistic convention that allowed the writer to communicate that something had happened without requiring him to describe what that something was. The conventions were consistent across decades of frontier writing. Every account uses the same indirect vocabulary. Every account assumes the reader understands what the vocabulary conceals. The assumption was correct. The readers understood. The words were sufficient. What they described did not require elaboration because the frontier population knew exactly what depredations meant when it was applied to women on isolated claims visited by armed men in the night. The daughters were the primary targets. The accounts that specify the victims of these attacks distinguish between what was done to wives and what was done to daughters with a consistency that suggests the distinction mattered to the attackers. Wives were brutalized and left behind. Daughters were taken. The difference was commercial. A wife left behind on a destroyed claim was a message, a demonstration of what happened to families in the wrong place without the right protection. A daughter taken was inventory. She was entering a supply chain that would move her from the claim to the camps to the establishments that were waiting to receive her. The networks that moved abducted women and girls from isolated claims to boomtown establishments were not improvised. They were supply chains. They operated with the same commercial logic that governed the movement of any commodity from point of origin to point of sale. The product was acquired at the source. It was transported along established routes. It was delivered to buyers who had placed orders based on demand. The language of commerce is appropriate because the networks operated as commerce. The fact that the commodity was human did not alter the structure. It only altered the moral weight that the structure carried. And in the mining regions of Gold Rush, California, moral weight was a currency that almost no one was spending. The gender imbalance created the demand. 300,000 men and a fraction of that number in women produced the market conditions that the legitimate migration could not satisfy. Women who came west voluntarily were wives of miners, a handful of entrepreneurs who opened boarding houses and laundries, and the women who chose to work in the saloons and dance halls for the money that the mining economy made available. These women, collectively, did not come close to meeting the demand that the population imbalance generated. The gap between supply and demand was filled by coercion. Girls taken from isolated claims entered the network at the point of acquisition. The men who took them were sometimes the same men who would transport them to their destination. More often, the acquisition and the transport were handled by different people, a division of labor that increased efficiency and reduced risk. The men who raided claims were specialists in violence. The men who moved girls from the mountains to the towns were specialists in logistics. The transfer between the two occurred at intermediate points, camps, or way stations along the trails connecting the mining regions to the larger settlements, where a girl acquired by one set of men was handed off to another set of men whose job was delivery rather than acquisition. The transport was designed to prevent escape and to prevent the girl from being identified by anyone who might be looking for her. The routes avoided the main trails where other travelers might observe a young woman being moved under obvious coercion. The timing favored night travel when visibility was limited. The girls were sometimes drugged with laudanum, the opium preparation that was freely available in every camp and trading post in the mining regions. A girl sedated with laudanum could be moved on horseback over considerable distances without the resistance that an alert captive would produce. The laudanum also began the process of chemical dependency that would later function as an additional mechanism of control in the establishments where the girls were delivered. The destinations were the boom towns, Sacramento, Stockton, Marysville, San Francisco, and the dozens of smaller settlements that had grown large enough to support the establishments that the mining economy demanded. The girl arrived at the establishment and was assigned to the owner or the manager who had arranged her acquisition. She was given clothing appropriate to her new function. She was assigned a debt. The debt was the system's structural genius. It converted captivity from a condition enforced by physical restraint into a condition enforced by arithmetic. The girl owed money. The debt included the cost of her transport, her clothing, her room, her food, and whatever other expenses the establishment chose to assign. Every dollar she generated was applied to the debt at a rate designed by the establishment's operator. The rate ensured that the debt never decreased. It grew. The girl worked to pay a balance that expanded faster than her labor could reduce it. She was trapped not by chains, but by numbers, and the numbers were controlled by the men who had purchased her. Let me know in the comments whether you think the men who bought whiskey in these establishments knew where the girls behind the bar had come from, because the answer tells you everything about what complicity looked like in the gold rush. It did not look like conspiracy. It looked like a man ordering a drink and not asking questions. The boomtown establishments that received, abducted, and coerced women were not hidden operations. They were the most visible businesses in the mining economy. They occupied the best locations on the main streets of every settlement large enough to have a main street. They were the brightest buildings in towns that were otherwise dark after sunset. They were open every night. They were loud, they were profitable, and they were accepted by the communities they operated in with a unanimity that reveals more about the gold rush than any story of prospectors and nuggets ever could. San Francisco by 1850 had more establishments employing women than it had churches, schools, and hospitals combined. Sacramento's waterfront district operated around the clock, the establishments running in shifts that ensured a continuous supply of women was available to the miners who arrived from the mountain camps carrying gold dust and the determination to spend it before returning to their claims. Stockton, Marysville, Sonora, Columbia, and dozens of smaller towns replicated the pattern at whatever scale their population could support. The establishments were the economic engine of the boom towns. They generated more revenue per square foot than any other business in the mining economy. They attracted miners whose spending on alcohol and gambling and female company supported the surrounding businesses, the hotels and restaurants and supply stores that depended on the same customer base. A girl delivered to one of these establishments by the abduction network entered a system designed to prevent her departure with the same thoroughness that the network had applied to preventing her escape during transport. The debt was the primary mechanism, but the debt was reinforced by additional layers of control that operated simultaneously. Physical control. The establishments were structured to limit movement. The girls lived in rooms within or directly adjacent to the establishment. They did not leave the building without permission. The doors were monitored. The windows were too small to climb through or were on upper floors that made escape by window a calculation of broken bones versus continued captivity. Armed men employed by the establishment maintained order and ensured that the girls remained where the business required them to be. Chemical control. Laudanum, whiskey, and other substances were provided to the girls initially as comfort and subsequently as necessity. The dependency that the transport process had begun was deepened deliberately during the first weeks at the establishment. A girl who was dependent on laudanum was a girl whose need for the substance overrode her desire to escape, because escape meant withdrawal, and withdrawal in the 19th century, without medical support, was an experience severe enough to deter even the most determined. Social control. A girl in a boomtown establishment was marked. The community knew where she was and what she did. If she escaped, she carried that knowledge with her into a population that classified her by her occupation rather than her circumstances. A girl who fled an establishment was not received by the respectable community as a victim. She was classified as what the establishment had made her. The classification followed her. It preceded her into any interaction with any person who knew where she had been. The social stigma of the establishment functioned as a wall, more effective than any physical barrier, because it existed everywhere, in every town, in every interaction, in the eyes of every person who looked at her and saw not a kidnapped daughter, but a fallen woman. The community's judgment was the final lock on a cage that the abduction network had built and that the establishment maintained, and that the entire social structure of the gold rush reinforced without ever acknowledging that. Reinforcement was what it was doing. The evidence of what was done to Gold Rush daughters survives in fragments, pieces of a picture that no single source preserves in full, but that the fragments, assembled across hundreds of diaries and letters and newspaper accounts, and the occasional memoir written decades later by men who could not forget what they had seen, compose into an image clear enough to make the silence that surrounds it inexcusable. The sources are scattered because the conditions that produced the violence also prevented its documentation. No courts meant no trial records. No law enforcement meant no investigation files. No coroners meant no official cause of death recorded for the bodies found on isolated claims. The bureaucratic infrastructure that transforms human suffering into historical evidence did not exist in the mining regions during the years when the suffering was most severe. What survives was preserved by individuals who chose to record what they witnessed in private documents that were never intended for publication and that carry the weight of testimony delivered without an audience. A miner's diary from the Hangtown district in 1850 describes finding a cabin on a neighboring claim burned to its frame. The father was dead outside the door. He had been shot. The mother was found 2 miles from the cabin, beaten, left in a ravine where the men who had attacked the family apparently assumed she would not survive. She survived. The 2 daughters, aged 14 and 16, were not found. The miner records that the camp organized a search party that covered the surrounding claims and trails for 3 days. The daughters were not recovered. The diary entry ends with a sentence that carries the weight of everything the miner understood and could not change. "Gone into the country," he wrote, meaning gone into the network, gone into the system, gone. Letters from women in the mining camps to relatives in the eastern states contain references to the danger that are simultaneously urgent and coded. A woman writing to her sister in Ohio in 1851 describes the camps as no place for a girl without protection. She describes a neighbor's daughter who disappeared from a claim on the upper river and who was later seen in a settlement 30 miles south in circumstances. The letter describes only as dreadful. The woman does not elaborate. The conventions of correspondence in the era did not permit the elaboration that the circumstances demanded, but the letter communicates enough. The sister in Ohio understood what dreadful meant when applied to a girl who had disappeared from a claim and been found in a settlement. The word was sufficient. Newspaper accounts from the few camp editors who had the courage to print what others preferred to ignore provide the most detailed surviving evidence. A paper in Sonora in 1852 published an account of a family attacked on a claim south of the Tuolumne River. The account names the family. It describes the attack in the indirect vocabulary that frontier journalism had developed for these events. It notes that the eldest daughter, aged 17, was carried off by the perpetrators. It notes that no pursuit was organized because no authority existed to organize one. The account occupies 4 column inches in a newspaper that devoted its front page to mining claims and commodity prices. 4 inches for the destruction of a family, the rest of the page for the price of flour. Memoirs written decades later by men who had lived through the gold rush years contain passages that suggest the writers had carried the memories for years and had finally reached an age where the weight of silence exceeded the weight of speaking. A man writing in 1890 about his years in the camps describes an evening in a Stockton establishment where he recognized a girl he had seen months earlier at a mining camp on the Mokelumne River, where she had been living with her family on a claim. He describes her appearance in the establishment, the change in her manner and her eyes, in language that communicates the transformation without describing its mechanism. He does not explain how she came to be there. He does not need to. The distance between the claim on the Mokelumne and the establishment in Stockton was a distance measured not in miles but in everything that had been taken from her between the two locations. The question that the evidence forces is not why this happened, but why no one stopped it. The answer is structural. The victimization of Gold Rush daughters was not a failure of the system. It was the system functioning as designed. Every element of the mining region's social and economic structure contributed to the continuation of the predation, not through active conspiracy, but through a convergence of interests and absences that produced the same result conspiracy would have produced. The legal vacuum was the foundation. But the legal vacuum alone does not explain why the exploitation continued after the vacuum began to fill. California achieved statehood in 1850. Courts were established. Sheriffs were appointed. The apparatus of law began its slow extension from the coastal cities into the interior. By 1852, some mining camps had formal law enforcement. By 1854, most significant settlements had at least a nominal judicial presence. The law arrived. It did not address the problem. It did not address the problem because the problem was embedded in the economic structure that the law was being asked to protect. The boomtown establishments that held coerced women were among the most profitable businesses in the mining economy. They paid taxes. In settlements where taxes funded the salaries of the sheriffs and the judges and the clerks who maintained the legal system, the establishments were financing the very institutions that might have shut them down. A sheriff whose salary was paid from tax revenue generated in part by the establishments he was theoretically responsible for policing faced a conflict of interest so fundamental that resolution was impossible without eliminating either the sheriff or the establishments. The establishments remained. The sheriffs learned to direct their attention elsewhere. Economic complicity extended beyond the tax base. The merchants who sold supplies to the establishments were complicit. The landlords who leased buildings to the establishments were complicit. The hotel owners whose rooms were filled by miners who came to town because the establishments attracted them were complicit. The entire commercial ecosystem of the boomtowns was interconnected in ways that made the exploitation of women a load-bearing element of the local economy. Remove it, and the structure above it trembled. No one with a financial interest in the structure's stability was prepared to remove it. The gender ratio provided the final element. In a population that was overwhelmingly male, every institution, formal and informal, was controlled by men. The miners' courts, the vigilance committees, the town councils that formed as settlements grew, the juries that sat when courts were finally established. Everybody that might have addressed the exploitation of women was composed entirely of men who did not experience the vulnerability that women experienced and who were, in many cases, customers of the establishments they would have needed to shut down. The perspective of the women inside the system was not represented in any forum where decisions were made. Their testimony was not solicited. Their experience was not consulted. They existed within a system that had been built around them and that was maintained by people who benefited from their presence within it. The few voices that spoke against the system were individual, and they were ineffective. A minister who preached against the establishments from a tent church on a Sunday morning was ignored by a congregation that visited those establishments on Saturday night. A newspaper editor who published accounts of attacks on families was read and forgotten by readers who turned the page to the mining reports. A miner who organized a search party for a missing girl from a neighboring claim found sympathy and assistance for 3 days and indifference on the 4th because the mining economy did not pause for individual tragedies, and the men who participated in the search had claims of their own that required their attention. The system was not defended by force. It was defended by inertia, by the slow, heavy, immovable weight of an economy that had incorporated the exploitation of women into its foundations, and that could not remove it without excavating those foundations entirely. The youngest victims disappeared most completely. Children taken from gold rush families entered a world that had constructed no category for their protection, and that processed them through the same commercial logic it applied to adults, adjusted only by the calculations of a market that assigned value based on utility rather than humanity. Girls of 13 and 14 taken in raids on isolated claims were delivered to the same boomtown establishments that received adult women. The age protections that existed in Eastern law, such as they were, had not crossed the mountains. The mining regions operated under legal codes that were either non-existent or unenforced, and the informal codes that governed the camps did not include provisions for the protection of children in establishments whose existence the codes tacitly endorsed. A girl of 14 delivered to an establishment in Sacramento or Stockton was put to the same use as an adult woman. Her youth did not protect her. It increased her commercial value. The demand structure of the camps, shaped by a population of men whose moral frameworks had been loosened by distance from the communities that had maintained them, placed a premium on youth that the establishment operators understood and exploited. A younger girl generated more revenue. The market determined her treatment. The market did not consult her age. Children too young for the establishments faced different fates that were equally governed by commercial calculation. Some were kept by the men who had taken them, absorbed into households where they performed labor that ranged from domestic service to work on mining claims. A child of 8 or 9 working a sluice box alongside the man who had killed her father was not a scenario that the gold rush mythology includes in its narrative of American ambition. It happened. The accounts that survive describe it with a flat affect of witnesses reporting facts too common to warrant the emotional language that distance might later attach to them. Some children were sold to families who wanted household labor. The transactions were informal, conducted without documents, without witnesses, without any record that might later serve as evidence. A child passed from one set of hands to another in exchange for gold dust weighed on a scale in a camp where no one would think to question how a man had acquired a child who did not resemble him and who flinched when he raised his voice. The question was not asked because asking it would have required the asker to act on the answer. And acting on the answer would have required an authority that did not exist and a moral framework that the camps had not constructed. Some children simply vanished. Their fates are unrecorded because no system existed to track them. The gold rush produced orphans and displaced children at a rate that overwhelmed the minimal charitable infrastructure available. A handful of religious missions in the larger settlements took in children who appeared at their doors. The missions were underfunded, understaffed, and incapable of absorbing the volume of displaced children the mining regions produced. The children who did not reach the missions, who remained in the mountains and the camps in the custody of men whose intentions the historical record does not describe because no one was recording, occupied a space in the gold rush that the American memory has refused to examine. The gold rush is taught as a story about what Americans built when they went west. The 49ers, the boom towns, the beginning of California. It is never taught as a story about the children who were consumed by the lawlessness that the building required. Children whose parents brought them west in wagons, loaded with dreams and flour, and the belief that the law would follow them. The law did not follow. The children paid the price. And the price was not recorded because the people who should have recorded it were the same people whose failure to act had made the payment necessary. Drop a comment about what it means that a nation celebrates the gold rush without acknowledging what it cost the smallest and most defenseless people who were caught inside it. Because the celebration has lasted 175 years, the silence has lasted just as long. The resistance was real. It was also inadequate. The people who tried to address the victimization of gold rush families fought against a system that was sustained by the same forces that sustained the mining economy itself, and their efforts, however sincere, were absorbed by that system, the way a river absorbs a stone thrown into its current. The stone displaces water. The river continues. Vigilance committees formed in some camps to address crimes that the absent legal system could not. The committees were composed of miners who had decided that the lawlessness had exceeded what they were willing to tolerate. They held trials. They rendered verdicts. They hanged men. The San Francisco Committee of Vigilance of 1851 is the most documented example, but smaller committees operated in camps across the mining regions with varying degrees of organization and varying degrees of justice. The committees addressed the most visible crimes: murder, theft of claim gold, horse stealing, which the frontier classified as a capital offense because a man without a horse in the mountains was a man sentenced to die slowly. The committees occasionally caught and hanged a bandit who had attacked a family on an isolated claim. The hanging was public. The body was left visible as deterrent. The deterrent was insufficient because the committees addressed individuals rather than systems. A hanged bandit was one man removed from a network that contained dozens. The network replaced him the way any commercial operation replaces a lost employee. The committees did not dismantle the networks because dismantling networks required sustained investigation, coordination across multiple camps, and the kind of institutional capacity that vigilance committees, composed of miners who had claims to work and families to feed, did not possess. They had the will to hang a man. They did not have the resources to follow the chain from the man on the rope to the man who had sent him to the claim, to the man who had received the girl he took to the establishment where the girl was held. The chain was too long. The committee's reach was too short. Individual miners organized search parties when families on neighboring claims were attacked. These efforts were genuine, and they were sometimes successful in recovering stolen property and even, occasionally, in recovering women who had been taken. A search party that moved quickly enough could intercept the transport before it reached the network's intermediate transfer points. But quickly enough meant within hours, and the miners who formed search parties were men who learned of the attack after it had occurred, who needed time to assemble and arm themselves and determine a direction of pursuit, and who were tracking men through terrain that favored the pursued over the pursuers. The search parties that succeeded were the exception. The search parties that failed, that returned to camp after days of riding through mountain terrain without finding the men they sought, were the rule. The few women who escaped Boomtown captivity provided testimony that, had any court been willing to hear it, would have revealed the full scale of the system that held them. Some of these accounts survive in fragments, recorded by ministers or missionaries who encountered escaped women at religious missions, and who wrote down what they were told with the horrified precision of people hearing information they had suspected but had not confirmed. The accounts described the acquisition, the transport, the debt system, the chemical dependency, and the daily reality of life inside the establishments, with a consistency that confirms the system standardization across the mining regions. The women described the same mechanisms operating in different towns, the same debt structures, the same control methods, the same impossibility of departure. The system was not improvised differently in each location. It was replicated. It was a model. And the model worked well enough that the women who escaped it were the rare exceptions whose accounts illuminate the experience of the thousands who did not escape and whose testimony was never recorded. Return to the Whitfield cabin on the American River, November of 1849. The three men who rode up to the cabin in the early evening had been watching the claim for 2 days. They knew Thomas worked the river until the light failed. They knew he left his rifle in the cabin because carrying it to the river interfered with the panning. They knew Margaret and the 2 girls were alone in the cabin during the working hours, and that Thomas returned at dusk. They chose dusk. The moment when Thomas was walking back from the river, tired, his hands numb from the water, his rifle still inside the cabin where it was useless to him and available to the men who had arrived before him, Thomas saw the horses first. 3 horses tied to the pine stump he used for splitting firewood. He started running. He covered 30 yards before the first man stepped out of the cabin and leveled a revolver at his chest. Thomas stopped. The mathematics were immediate, and they were final. 1 man with empty hands against 3 men with loaded weapons. He did not reach the cabin door. They beat him, not to kill him, but to incapacitate him. A dead man on a claim attracted attention from neighboring miners who might investigate. A beaten man on a claim was a man who could not follow, could not fight, and could not reach the nearest camp in time to organize any response before the men, and whatever they took, were deep into the mountains. They broke his right arm. They left him on the ground outside the cabin and went inside and closed the canvas flap that served as a door. Margaret was found by Thomas after the men left. She was alive. The account that survives does not describe her condition in detail. It uses the vocabulary that frontier accounts always use. Outraged. The word that means everything and says nothing. The word that communicates the full scope of what was done while maintaining the linguistic distance that the era demanded between the event and its description. Margaret survived. The injuries she carried were not the kind that killed immediately. They were the kind that lasted. Anne, the 12-year-old, was found inside the cabin. She had been hurt. The account describes her injuries as severe but does not elaborate further. She was alive. She would recover physically. The account does not speculate about any other kind of recovery, because the frontier did not possess the vocabulary for trauma that had not yet been named. Sarah was not in the cabin. Sarah, the 15-year-old, was gone. The men had taken her. She had left the cabin on the back of a horse belonging to a man she had never seen before that evening, riding into mountain terrain in the dark, heading in a direction that Thomas, with his broken arm and his beaten body, could not determine and could not follow. Thomas reached the nearest camp the following morning. He told the miners what had happened. The response was what the mining camps always provided: sympathy, whiskey. The information that no sheriff existed within 100 miles and that no court had jurisdiction over a crime committed on an unincorporated claim in a territory that had not yet organized its legal system. A search party formed. 11 men rode out that afternoon. They searched for 4 days. They found tracks that led south along the river and then east into the mountains, and then disappeared on rocky ground that held no prints. They returned to camp without Sarah. Sarah Whitfield was 15 years old. She had left Independence, Missouri 7 months earlier on a wagon beside her mother and her sister, with her father's promise that California was going to change everything for the family. California changed everything. Sarah entered the network that was waiting to receive her, and she disappeared into the gold rush the way hundreds of daughters disappeared, completely, permanently, without a record that any court would ever examine, or any newspaper would ever print, or any history textbook would ever include in its chapter on the great westward migration and the birth of the American dream. The gold rush ended the way gold rushes end. The easy gold was exhausted by the mid-1850s. The surface deposits that a man with a pen and a strong back could extract from a riverbed were gone, replaced by deep deposits that required industrial equipment, capital investment, and organized labor to reach. The individual prospector, the iconic figure of the gold rush mythology, was replaced by the mining company. The companies brought machinery. They brought engineers. They brought a corporate structure that had no use for the lone miner with his pen and his dream. The 300,000 people who had poured into California receded. Some stayed and built lives in the state they had helped create. Most left, heading back east or onward to the next strike in Nevada or Colorado or Montana, carrying whatever the rush had given them and whatever it had taken. The boom towns contracted. San Francisco survived and grew into a city. Sacramento survived as the state capital. Most of the smaller settlements did not survive. The wooden buildings that had been thrown up in months collapsed in years. The canvas tents rotted. The saloon signs faded. The streets that had been packed with miners spending gold dust on whiskey and women emptied, and were reclaimed by the grass and the manzanita that had been there before the gold was found. Ghost towns. Dozens of them scattered across the Sierra foothills, the remains visited today by tourists who photographed the weathered buildings and read the plaques that describe the bustling communities that once occupied these sites. The legal infrastructure that had been absent during the peak years finally arrived in force. Courts, sheriffs, jails, district attorneys, the full apparatus of American law established in communities that had operated without it for nearly a decade. The law arrived too late for the women and girls who had been consumed during the lawless years. The daughters taken from isolated claims were already gone, absorbed into systems that kept no records of their acquisition, buried in unmarked graves behind establishments that the communities they served had treated as legitimate businesses, living under names that were not their own in cities that were not their homes, carrying the scars of what had been done to them in cabins and on trails, and in rooms above saloons in towns that no longer existed. The law could not find them because the law had not been present when they were taken, and because the system that took them had been designed to operate in the law's absence and to leave no evidence that the law could later use. The gold rush is commemorated today as a foundational American story, the beginning of California, the expression of the pioneer spirit, the democratic adventure that transformed a remote territory into the most dynamic state in the Union. The commemoration is carved into monuments and printed into textbooks and performed annually in festivals that celebrate the 49ers with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of communities honoring their origin story. The gold pen is a symbol. The covered wagon is a symbol. The miner with his beard and his boots and his dream is a symbol. They are symbols of what Americans found when they went west. The commemoration does not include the Whitfield cabin. It does not include the 3 men on horses who watched from the ridgeline. It does not include Sarah, 15 years old, riding into the mountains on the back of a stranger's horse. It does not include the camps where no law existed, and the establishments where no escape existed, and the trails where no help existed. It does not include the daughters. The gold rush is taught as a story about what Americans built. It should also be taught as a story about what Americans destroyed. And the destruction fell heaviest on the people who had the least voice in the decision to go west, and the least protection when they arrived. Families who trusted that the law would follow them into the new territory. Mothers who believed that the country they were citizens of would not abandon them to lawlessness. Daughters who climbed onto wagons beside their fathers and believed that the journey was taking them toward something better. The journey took Sarah Whitfield into the mountains, and the mountains kept her, and the gold rush moved on, and the textbooks were written, and the monuments were carved, and the story was told and retold for 175 years, without her name in it. Her name is in it now. If what you have learned today matters, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button and the notification bell. Share this video with anyone who learned about the gold rush in school and was taught only the version that the monuments preserve. Drop a comment telling me whose story you will carry with you and tell me where you're watching from. Because Sarah Whitfield and the hundreds of daughters like her deserve to be part of the story that their country has been telling without them since 1849. But the gold rush was not the only American migration that consumed the women and children who followed it. There is another chapter from another frontier where the pattern repeated and the silence lasted even longer. That story is waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen.